On this week's edition of New York Now, state lawmakers are back in Albany next week ahead of hearings on the state's coronavirus response. We'll discuss with Bernadette Hogan from the New York Post and Josefa Velasquez from the nonprofit news organization The City. Schools are preparing for students to return in the fall, but that's shaping up to be no easy task. We'll speak with Jasmine Gripper from the Alliance for Quality Education. We have the next part of our series on women's suffrage in New York. This week, we'll look at what happened after women won the right to vote and a look at community health in the context of COVID-19. I'm Dan Clark, and this is New York Now.
Today, the Senate majority will pass legislation.
We will pass a law prohibiting it, and we will take them to court challenging it.
Taking yet another stand for New York and sending a message to the nation.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. We've got a lot to get to on this week's show. Let's get right into it with the news of the week from Bernadette Hogan with the New York Post and Josefa Velasquez from the nonprofit news organization, The City. Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So let's talk about everything that happened this week and what's going to happen next week. Let's start with the governor's comments this week. I think something that really blew a lot of people away was it happened on Thursday. The governor said that now restaurants and bars will have to serve food in order to also serve alcohol. So we won't see any more of those situations where people are just going to bars for a drink. They'll have to have some sort of food. Bern, tell me what this means for bars and restaurants, because we were speaking earlier this week, and it really sounds to me like it's effectively closing some bars.
Right, exactly. So today the governor announced that statewide bars and restaurants, if a person goes in and they want to get a drink, they have to also order food. Otherwise, the bar or restaurant can't serve them. But this really stems from what we're seeing, a lot of non-compliance and violations of social distancing, especially down in New York City. And last week and this week, we saw violations in some bars close. And we've seen a spike in coronavirus cases in young people, ages 20 to 29, allegedly, which is an interesting sect, but mainly because it's nice out and they've been outside. But this came down today. And also there's now a 3-strike rule. So if bars and restaurants down in the city have 3 strikes against them, they have to close their doors. They're done.
Josefa, you live in the borough of Queens right now. Tell me what you've seen down there in the city. Is there this major outburst of non-compliance in bars and restaurants from what you've seen? I know that we're only talking about Queens. You obviously probably travel to other boroughs, but tell me what you've seen down there.
I mean, walking through the street, you would hardly know that we were in the midst of a pandemic. There are so many people at bars and restaurants. They're now hanging out. There's bar stools and chairs and tables on the sidewalk and on the street itself. But people have been yearning to go outside and go out to eat. You have like live music in some places, and they're jam-packed. I mean, these are restaurants that, a few months ago would be hardly 10 people inside, and now they're like full to the brim with people. And it's hard to wear a mask and socially distance when you have a stretch of like 10 feet to call your restaurant space.
So let's talk about next week. The legislature is making a return to Albany, and I've looked through the bills that they might consider taking up, and we don't really know what's going to happen as far as what the final product is. There's also this question of, is next week the last week of legislative session of the entire year? Bern, let's go to you first. What are we expecting to see out of next week from the state legislature?
Right, well, it's definitely a weird time. I mean, I haven't been here when I've covered the legislature this far into the summer. We're in July, mid-July now. But there's a couple bills that are on the agendas that I've looked at, but one group that I've been concentrating on has to do with nursing homes and adult care facilities. A group of lawmakers held a press conference today, a package to firm up some policies and also maybe reverse some that they thought were controversial and problematic during the pandemic. And of course, this comes ahead of some hearings that have been scheduled, especially in light of the pandemic, but then also concerning nursing home policy. So one of which has to do with rolling back this lawsuit immunity regulation that was passed in the state budget back in April that gave hospitals and nursing home operators immunity from any lawsuits that were waged for care of patients. So that's something that we'll be looking at next week. I don't know if it'll go, but of course the lawmakers pushing that have some hopes that it will.
I want to talk about those nursing homes in a second, but Josefa, open up your notebook for me. Tell me what you're looking at next week.
So I think a lot of the stuff that the legislature has to do are small bills that just keep local government going. From what I've heard, there is nothing in place in terms of raising revenues for the state, which it desperately needs right now. As Bern said, there are provisions in the budget that allow the governor to slash funding. And that would, once the governor puts up his proposal, the legislature has 10 days to come back and counteract that. The governor hasn't proposed any funding, so the legislature hasn't yet come up with their plan, but I'm hearing that they are starting to develop wide sweeping measures on how to raise money for the state, given that tax revenues have declined and that people are losing their jobs.
So let's go back to nursing homes now, because Bern, you and I were talking earlier this week about the report that came out last week from DOH that basically said the state was not at fault for any of the nursing home deaths from COVID-19. The Associated Press and also the New York Post had a story this week saying that this study, it wouldn't have appeared in a peer-reviewed journal. Basically, a lot of experts came out and said, you know, there are some fishy facts about this. Bern, tell me what they were saying.
Right. So this report came out last week, and it was a much awaited report. We didn't really know when it was going to drop, but of course, the past 3-4 months, there's been a lot of talk about how the pandemic has hit this population of nursing homes and older people. But essentially, the report said that the governor's policies and the health department's policies didn't necessarily drive up the nursing home deaths in regards to the coronavirus, but a piece came out in the Associated Press earlier this week that got several opinions from epidemiologists, people who work in the field, that said this wouldn't stand up. At least one individual said this would not stand up in a peer-reviewed journal, which is pretty biting considering the health department, which of course it was an internal report of their own policies. They put a lot of time into this and were hoping that it would kind of clear the air, especially when it comes to a lot of criticism on the topic.
Before I let you guys go, Josefa, as Bern mentioned earlier, the legislature is going to be holding hearings on COVID-19 in the coming weeks. One of those hearings, long anticipated, is about nursing homes in New York State, the handling of nursing homes. The legislature obviously has subpoena power, so they could force the Department of Health to show up if they don't agree to. You covered nursing homes down to the wire, as Bern did as well. Tell me what lawmakers are going to be looking at really quick.
So it all comes down to how many people actually died and how many people contracted the coronavirus. We still don't have an accurate toll of how many nursing home residents died, because the way that the state counts it, it only is counted as a nursing home death if you died within the facility. If you got transferred to a hospital, you don't count. And it all comes down to, well, how many people got infected and how does the infection get into the facility itself? Was it actually through staff, which is what the administration is saying, or did it actually come from this March 25th policy where people with the virus were allowed to enter the facilities?
All right, Bernadette Hogan from the New York Post, Josefa Velasquez from the nonprofit news organization The City. Thanks for being here as always. Schools in New York are getting ready to reopen this fall, but that's easier said than done. The state released guidance this week to help schools plan for the school year, and teachers are going to have to strike a difficult balance between keeping students safe and providing them with a good education. There are a lot of opinions on how to do that. I spoke with Jasmine Gripper from the Alliance for Quality Education. Jasmine, thanks for being here on New York Now this week.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. So there is a lot to talk about with education, and you're tapped into the education community. You know what teachers and parents are thinking. At the same time, you've seen what the state has done to schools over the past few months and everything that's happened there. Should we reopen schools in September? Are schools ready for that? And are we at a place where students can go back into class?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think, one, we have to rely on the data from the scientists around whether or not it's safe for people to gather in person. And based on that data and based on scientists' recommendations, we should figure out what we should do. So in the meantime, what we need school districts to do is probably come up with a multiple set of plans. What is learning look like? What will learning look like if it's completely remote? And how do we do it well? What will learning look like if it has to be a hybrid approach of some in-person and some remote learning? And what will learning look like if it can be resumed in school? And schools really have to create these plans with really little guidelines from the state and from the federal government. And so the goal is to strive to in-person learning, but not at the risk of putting families and students and educators in danger.
Right. The state education department released some guidance this week, basically saying that schools will have to put in all of these safeguards: social distancing, students must wear masks. Everything obviously has to be cleaned regularly just to keep students and teachers as safe as possible. At the same time, we don't know if they're going back to class, and there's also this possibility of totally online learning. Is it even possible, Jasmine? I mean, from your perspective, can we have these teachers teach students at the same quality that they're used to year after year with all of these limitations in place? And I don't want to say that those limitations are bad, but certainly they change things for teachers and their jobs.
It's definitely going to be hard for educators, and it's hard for parents as well, dealing with children at home the entire day. I'm trying to help multiple children deal with learning in different settings, having limited devices in the home and having limited connectivity. For some parents, their internet is stressed because the parents are working remotely and the kids are trying to do online learning. And so this is hard for everyone all around. If you think about the beginning of the school year in a typical year, parents are usually the ones who buy the tissue, the hand sanitizer, and all the other supplies for the classroom, things that are like really hard to find right now and more expensive. And so how do we go back to school if parents aren't able to provide those supplies? So how do we, I think a lot of people don't trust that the school district will be able to get the cleaning part correct, and that instead they will be depending on teachers to pick up the slack, which is not acceptable. We actually need to clean our schools, our school buses adequately to make sure we prevent the spread of any disease. I think the other part of that is what's going to happen. How do you enforce wearing a mask? You know, yes, kids should wear a mask, but tell that to a 6-year-old who just wants to run around and play.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, I don't even see grown adults wearing masks the right way in Target. How are we going to have 5-year-olds wear these masks in class correctly all day?
Yeah, and then the other thing, and I think the state education department recognizes, kids learn about facial cues. And so really like not being able to see a part of an adult's face to see that they're smiling at them is not good. And what kids need to thrive is the relationship building. And so how do you keep educators and students safe if you can't see part of their face? And so the recommendations could be wear the clear face shields, but I'm not sure if that's adequate enough safety. One of the things I will say that was notably missing from the state education department's recommendations was that there were no waivers on state tests and the state regents. And I think that's really a little bit disappointing because school districts need to know early as possible if the test will be waived. And the sooner they can make those decisions and get that to school districts, the better they are prepared on how to start the school year and how to address the educational needs of students.
So you brought up a really good point before, and I want to touch on this because I think it's the conversation we have every year. It's about school funding. And a lot of these requirements cost money. I mean, there was part in the guidance where they talked about how schools may have to rent additional spaces to social distance out students. That's not a cheap cost. And like you said, cleaning supplies are going to come out of the pockets of teachers, or I mean, ideally the school district will supply them and the school district is funded by the state. At the same time, we have the governor threatening cuts to school districts. So how does funding play into all this? Can school districts realistically do this with the budgets that they have right now?
Absolutely not. School districts cannot do this well with the resources that they have. They are actually, if they try to implement this with the budgets that they have, they will be putting educators, students, and family at risk. They need more dollars and more resources, whether it's for the technology, whether it's for the cleaning, whether it's for the added transportation costs, the smaller class sizes, which require more educators, for the additional counselors to meet the social and emotional needs of students. It all costs money, and districts are already starving of resources. The state enacted budget that passed in April was inadequate to meet the needs of students. The governor threatening additional cuts. We are really concerned that the first payment, school districts get their money on a monthly basis. They get payments from the state. The first payment for the 2020-21 school year goes out in July. Cuomo has been known already to be withhold aid to localities. It's highly likely that he will withhold the first payment to school districts. But also, there's a whole lot of wealth here in New York. We have hundreds of billionaires that call New York home, and a small tax on those ultra rich can produce the billions of dollars in revenue that we need to fund our schools. And those billionaires aren't hurting right now. We've seen reports that said billionaires are accumulating more wealth in the midst of this financial crisis. We need New York's billionaires to do their share. We need them to contribute to our economy. And the only way they will do that is if the governor and the state legislature enact new taxes.
All right, Jasmine Gripper from the Alliance for Quality Education, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have more updates on schools in the coming weeks. Now turning to our series on women's suffrage in New York. Last week, we told you about what happened before women won the right to vote in the U.S. This week, we're looking at what happened right after. Misara Makati has the story.
The story of women and the vote continued in the early 1900s with a new generation of activists. Most of the original leaders of the movement, like Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Joslyn Gage, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, were gone. Through petition campaigns and marches, new leaders carried on the fight. The issue of race, so much a part of the early suffrage movement, continued. At the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., the well-known Black leader Ida B. Wells and her delegation were forced to march at the back. In spite of the tension, neither Black nor white women suffragists gave up the fight. 2 years later, at the state capitol in Albany, a referendum on suffrage for women failed to pass. On the national scene, in 1917, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns led the Silent Sentinels, who picketed outside the White House, arguing for a federal suffrage amendment. The response was brutal. Paul and Burns were arrested and tortured, but they never wavered in their commitment.
Everywhere we look in this period, everything was about suffrage, more and more and more. And the layers of activism and the layers of leadership, the layers of work that's happening at every stage, rural as well as urban. If you didn't have an opinion on suffrage, you were probably dead. It was that prevalent in this period.
In New York, the suffragist determination paid off. Nearly 70 years after the Seneca Falls Women's Right Convention in 1917, New York State women won the right to vote. New York suffragists celebrated, but there was still work to be done. A federal voting rights amendment had languished in Congress for more than 25 years. It took another 2 years for the women's suffrage amendment to pass both houses of Congress. In August 1920, the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the constitutional right to vote in the United States took effect. The impact of the voting power of women was widely discussed.
There were heightened expectations around achieving the vote. Some argue that too much was expected to happen too quickly in all areas for women, that they would vote in large numbers as a bloc, that they would succeed thereby in securing important issues for women, that large numbers of women would enter politics and win office. Women voted, but they were like any new group entering the voting arena, they were slow to use it.
Some New York women didn't hesitate to get involved. Women joined both the Democratic and Republican parties. Rhoda Fox Graves, a Republican from upstate New York, was elected to the state legislature in 1925.
Rhoda Fox Graves was the first woman in New York State to have a fully fleshed out political career as an elected legislator, and it was a career that she controlled. So in that sense, she's atypical. She set her own career path and achieved it. In other ways, she's very representative of the first several decades of women in New York State politics.
Rhoda Fox Graves was a skilled and conscientious legislator. Graves served as a New York State Assemblywoman, then Senator, from 1925 to 1948. She was a champion of rural causes and challenged the rise of corporate agricultural conglomerates.
She challenged the Republican establishment that was largely either silent or tacitly supportive of these conglomerates. And she made a name for herself, and she was beloved by her constituency for doing this.
In the 1920s and 30s, the Democratic Party had won favor among Black voters, which had generally supported the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, since the Civil War. In response, the Republican Party ran 2 Black women for the New York State Legislature, Eunice Carter in 1934 and Jane Bolin in 1936. Both women lost. The Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War shaped women's civic lives. There was pressure on women to exercise their civic duty by maintaining a strong home, supporting their husbands, and raising patriotic sons. It was a period of relative calm, but by the end of the 1950s, things started to change. A new generation of leaders emerged, suspicious of convention and ready for the next decade.
And again, the younger women imbued with the activism of the early 60s jump up, seize the mantle, and move forward. And we get the emergence of an organized women's movement. There is a cohort of them who are energized by the activism of the 1960s in all its manifestations: civil rights, women's rights, anti-war movement, eventually gay and lesbian rights. They see themselves as change agents. They look to government as the mechanism for rapid change. The 60s is very much an era where rapidity of change is expected.
In the 1960s, women became more active in politics and demanded more active participation. The days of stuffing envelopes and hosting lunches for candidates' wives gave way to running for elected office and bare-knuckles politics. In Brooklyn, the daughter of Jamaican immigrants started her climb up the ranks of the Democratic Party machine. Shirley Chisholm would surprise many men and women in New York and the country. Join us for part 3 next week on New York Now.
Join us next week for part 3. And for more on the national movement for women's suffrage, you can stream American Experience, The Vote, at WMHT.org. Before we let you go, medical professionals say the coronavirus pandemic has exposed a systemic inequality in the country's healthcare system. And that's also true for New York. Ryan Jones spoke with David Sandman from the New York State Health Foundation about community health in the era of COVID-19.
Public health has been put into perspective by the outbreak of the coronavirus. What has it revealed to you about the state of community health?
The pandemic has brought into even sharper relief all of the structural inequities that exist in our healthcare system and in society, and that's very often about race and about class. And if you look at the data, you see a very, very disproportionate impact on communities of color, on low-income communities, in terms of infection rates, especially in terms of death rates. And that should not come as a surprise to anybody. If we're looking at communities that already started with worse health status, that had many underlying health conditions like asthma, like diabetes, like cardiac disease, that left them more vulnerable, more likely to be without health insurance, and less likely to have disposable income, it's no surprise to people like me working in the field that those communities have yet again borne the brunt of this virus even worse.
Observing how the coronavirus has affected public health in such a short time, how do you see the conversation about community health and public health taking shape going forward?
It's a chance to repair and rebuild. In our country, we have underinvested in the public health infrastructure. We did not have adequate surveillance systems in place. We did not have adequate testing capacity in place. We don't have enough contact tracing capacity, what they sometimes call the disease detectives. We didn't have enough personal protective equipment. We underinvested in all of those things for so long, and the bill has tragically come due during this pandemic. And it is a chance now to rebuild and shift the paradigm toward a system that is more based on prevention, more based on primary care, and more based on public health protection, and not just providing very high-tech care for people once they are seriously ill.
We'll have an extended version of that conversation online. We have to leave it there for this week. Thanks for watching this week's New York Now. Have a great week and be well.